In terms of the kinds of climate scenarios that we have, if we don't increase emissions, if we just continue at our current rate, we're probably heading for something like 3 degrees, which I believe is already largely incompatible with human population being able to feed itself, for instance. It's already starting to put such extreme strain on biodiversity and ecosystems that it's hard to imagine that our crops and food systems could continue. And so these are sort of the most extreme scenarios are actually the continuation of what we're doing right now. So we really have to change direction in a very fundamental way and do it as rapidly as possible. Every day we lose, every year we lose, every decade we lose, we're going to make the world a worse and worse and worse place. And we're going to have to change radically in any case if we want to avoid these impacts. So people are already dying of climate impacts and climate catastrophes at 1.1, 1.2 degrees, which is where we are now. So indeed 1.5 degrees is already dangerous in terms of some people, some populations, some cities, some areas are going to be hit very badly, some islands are going to disappear. A 1.5 degree future is not an impact-free future. It's a future with fires, with floods, with storms, with large impacts. So it isn't safe. However, it's already very challenging from the level of emissions where we are now. We have to be very fast in order still to reach 1.5 degrees. So considering where we are now, 1.5 degrees might be an optimistic direction to head, because we also have to work on adaptation, which means on protecting populations in the most vulnerable parts of the world that really need protection from these climate impacts. So right now our governments are acting as though their main boss is economic growth, and what we're being sold and what a lot of our politicians believe is that good things come from economic growth in terms of human well-being and social prosperity. But that's not true. If you look at the data, if you look at how people actually prosper and what they actually need for their well-being, they do not need economic growth. They need societies that provide them with a dignified basis of life. So we need the social services and the public infrastructure that allows us to live good lives. That is what we need. Our governments really have to be changed because they won't change on their own. The reason that they're pursuing economic growth is because it's a goal that fits with industrial power and the power of corporations and the richest people who are in fact gathering that growth to themselves. So growth is really a mechanism of inequality and of wealth accumulation. And in that sense, our governments will have to be compelled to put people first, which means not focus on the 1%, but focus on everybody else and providing us all with good conditions of life. And good conditions of life do not have to be carbon intensive. That's the really important point. So actually originally net zero, like a lot of terms, net zero was actually a positive initiative. The point is it's very hard to get to zero emissions. From agriculture you have emissions. So there's some areas that it's really hard to eliminate. So the idea was that you eliminate as much as you can. So you get as close to zero, real zero, as you possibly can. And then you do things like allow ecosystems to thrive and store carbon in order to compensate for those emissions. So you basically allow the natural world to do the compensation for this tiny little bit of emissions that are left. But now net zero has been taken up to be basically a corporate greenwashing slogan by the fossil fuel industries and by a lot of governments who like to do, like Greta Thunberg says, blah, 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 instead of actually acting. So governments are seizing on net zero as a way to say, oh, we just continue as usual, and then we're going to subtract in the future at high cost in a way that I won't have to deal with. And so it really becomes and just not taking the challenge of climate action seriously. Yes, so basically the idea here is that instead of just compensating by allowing natural ecosystems to do what they normally do, which is store carbon, these governments really want to keep to imagine that they're going to be doing carbon capture and storage, which is taking carbon out of the atmosphere and transforming it, transporting it, and storing it underground in various ways. In some cases even worse, they imagine that that they can grow forests and then chop down the forests and store the carbon that way. The idea that you would use land that you could grow food on in a world where people are already facing food insecurity and climate famines, instead because some rich governments were too lazy to cut their own emissions, I think this is really criminal and honestly obscene. In terms of methane emissions, a lot of it comes from livestock agriculture, and everybody agrees in terms of the IPCC and what all the scientific literature says is that we have to move towards plant-based diets. It doesn't mean no meat or no dairy products, but it means very, very little, as well as very, very little fish. So it's like, maybe once a week or something like that on that level for everybody. Otherwise, we're not going to make it, partly because of the methane emissions.